So I want to correct something there. Certainly not single-handedly. 500 Startups is a global seed fund and accelerator. We started about 5 years ago, initially with about 5 people, but we now have about 90 people on our team. About a third of that team lives in 18 other countries. So we are in Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of people who are not in Silicon Valley, and some folks here in Turkey that I'm going to talk about a little bit later today, too. So how many of you are entrepreneurs or founders? I saw some hands raised. Okay. You guys are kind of tentative. You're not sure if you're an entrepreneur. You're not really kind of, maybe I'm an entrepreneur. How many people are investors? Anybody willing to admit that in the audience? Yes, I know. You don't want to say you're an investor. You're going to get mobbed by people. Okay, so this is going to be a really depressing presentation. I'm going to tell you how much being an investor or being an entrepreneur in emerging markets really sucks. It's just terrible. You should all leave and go home and don't do any more startups. It's really a bad idea. So here's the thing. There's not that many investors in emerging markets. There's certainly usually more startups and more founders than there are investors. How many of those investors, you want to raise your hands again? The ones I'm calling evil and stupid? Hassan Aslanova, obviously a very evil and stupid man. So, typical terms in a lot of emerging markets, are like, I want half your company for $50,000 or 70% of your company for a couple $100,000. It's not really that they're evil, at least most of them. It's just that there's not much supply for all the demand. There's not very many investors in a lot of emerging markets. In Silicon Valley and in Beijing, that's not really the case. There are lots of investors. And there's also been a history of exits in Silicon Valley that lead those investors to become greedy, and they have a fear of missing out. But in a lot of emerging markets, there's just clearly more demand than there is supply. And there's no urgency. There's not very much competition. And investors can afford to wait. They can afford to give you shitty terms, low valuations, not make investments at all, and you will still talk to them. In Silicon Valley, if investors behave that way, we generally ostracize them when we don't talk to them, and we tell other founders about them, and then they don't get any deals. And so bad behavior in Silicon Valley, or at least that kind of evil and term sheet behavior, is not rewarded if you want to be an investor on an ongoing basis. In emerging markets, unfortunately, you gotta suck it up. You gotta take what's available to you as a founder. If you don't like those terms, then run a cash flow-based business, borrow money from your mom, from other friends and family if you can. But it's going to be challenging. I will say, as you see exits in markets, those conditions tend to change. So big exits like Yemek Peti certainly are optimistic for the future for things to change. One thing I will ask investors is please stop asking for business plans and revenue projections. There's a lot of people who think that business plans are the source of a great business. I tend to disagree with them. I think that actual functional products and growth strategies are what are useful to build big businesses, and great founders, of course. But I'd rather see expense projections than revenue projections. At least you might not be lying to me about spending money. And I really want to see more marketing plans, not so much business plans. And by marketing plans, what I really just mean is test cases on how to acquire customers and some proof about how those marketing plans work. Not just the plans themselves, but the actual campaigns. Maybe some online search campaigns, maybe some other things that have brought in customers. Again, wins and exits are what is going to create fear of missing out, and that's what's going to create more investors, and hopefully as more competition occurs, those terms get less crappy. Unfortunately, the investor is not the only problem in the system. How many of you are entrepreneurs? Yes, most of us, I include myself in this, actually both an entrepreneur and an investor, we're clueless, at least when we're first starting out. Usually, we don't know what we're doing. And really, that's actually kind of a good thing, because if we knew what we were doing, we would probably never become an entrepreneur. There's a lot of downsides to starting a business. What's needed? We'd like to have mentorship. We'd like to have people who've gone through it before. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who are investing haven't necessarily gone through it before. They might have been successful in other types of businesses, but they may not have internet entrepreneurship experience. They may not have expertise in a lot of the areas that you may need. And there's lots of talented engineers all over the world, but there's still growth in product management, design and usability, user experience. And most importantly, what I think is really lacking is a lack of attention to online marketing, analytically driven marketing, or growth hacking as the terms come. Again, this is changing as you have a first generation of entrepreneurs that have wins and have exits. The employees and teams at those companies start their own companies. Those first generation winners become mentors. Hopefully they become investors as well. This one's not really true anymore. It used to be that, at least for me, I used to get a lot of feedback about investing around the world. Why are you investing around the world, Dave? There's no customers. Most of the customers are in the US or in the Europe or in maybe China. But that's not really true anymore. There are huge audiences in emerging markets. Mobile phones and smartphones now are growing like crazy. China and India are going to be very large markets. But really, other markets that even have 50 to 100 million customers are also large. There's increasing internet penetration. There's increasing and rising GDP, improvements in payments and logistics. As mentioned before, local markets, you can bridge to regional markets, hopefully to global markets. So really, the markets are getting bigger, both the local markets and access to the global markets. And most of those customers are now have some method of payment, or at least they will in the next 3 to 5 years. So although this has been a historical problem, it's not very much of a problem going forward. Okay, so this is the one that I really feel is an area for everyone to focus on. It's not a local market issue. It's not an emerging market issue. It's just that entrepreneurs tend to be in love with features. They tend to build lots and lots of features. They ship code, they ship features. That's seemingly the measure of progress. Not really. Actually, what I think is most likely the measure of progress is understanding where and how you can get customers, what the cost of acquiring those customers are, what's the revenue those customers generate, when is that revenue generated, and building a financial model and a mathematical model for how you acquire customers. And so actually, it turns out that building product features, while that may be something that seems like progress, actually getting customers and getting customers to come back and hopefully to tell other customers, that's probably a better measure of progress. In particular, a better thing that I think than business plans is understanding unit economics for your business, for your customers. What do I mean by unit economics? What does it cost to acquire a customer? What does it cost to build and deliver product? Maybe even what does it cost to support that customer after you deliver product? When is the revenue coming in? Are you delivering a product that people pay for up front? Do they pay for on a subscription basis over time? And starting to build a financial model for here's the customer inputs and costs, here's the revenue generated and output. Do I get revenue as the transaction occurs? Or do I have to spend revenue and hold inventory and then I get revenue later? Right? And once you start to build that financial model, a couple of things start happening. You start understanding where do you need to tweak that to actually make money. Sometimes you may start out with unit economics that are not even profitable. You may also find that you have profitable unit economics, but only at small scale. And you may need to figure out how can I grow that business while still maintaining some unit economics. So understanding the financial model and then building a marketing campaign or a set of marketing campaigns around understanding that financial model is really what is the essence of a lot of learning for startups as they're getting off the ground. And unfortunately, what's challenging is those metrics are changing, right? And hopefully they are changing for the better as you get better at figuring out customer conversion, better marketing channels, better marketing campaigns, better improvements in products, and differentiation with other products that might be competitive. If you'd like to find out more about this in particular, we've run a conference called Weapons of Mass Distribution. That's the different type of WMD. Sorry if we make people a little bit worried about that acronym. But we have plenty of videos from those conferences over the last 3 years if you'd like to check that out at wmd.co. Okay, another thing that's problematic about emerging markets, there's not many exits. Usually that's a function of having not many acquirers, and most of them are small. Again, supply-demand issue. Where are the unicorns? Why should I invest in that market if there aren't any big wins? Well, the good thing is that there are now acquirers that are starting to acquire across borders. You have European companies acquiring companies in the Middle East and here in Turkey. You have companies in Japan, China, Korea, US, all crossing borders to establish presence in other markets. You have non-technology companies realizing that their businesses are under threat and they have to start looking at acquiring companies. So you're probably not going to see Microsoft or Google or Facebook acquire a food delivery company or a healthcare company, but you might see the equivalent non-tech companies in those businesses start to look at whether they need to acquire startups. Again, there's lots of global companies that are looking for emerging market footprints and figuring out strategies where you can grow from local markets to regional markets, and global markets hopefully are starting to change that. Now, we can't change the past necessarily. There haven't been as many historical exits in emerging markets, but the future looks bright. Those 3 billion smartphones, soon to be 4 or 5 billion smartphones, they're going to start, driving interest in those emerging markets, and acquirers will start paying attention. Another thing that's a challenge is that sometimes a very simple bet on real estate has a much higher return than startups with a lower failure profile. In fact, in many emerging markets, investing in a real estate play is probably just an index bet on the overall country's growth and a simpler way to get access to that growth than startups. So startups are not real estate. Let me emphasize that again. Startups are not real estate. If you're a real estate investor expecting real estate returns, do not invest in startups because most of them are going to fail. So why invest in startups at all? Well, occasionally a few startups do well, and some of those do really well. And so while you might get 10, 20, 30% returns in the real estate market, and occasionally even more than that, you're going to have some bumps in the real estate market at some point. And startups, aside from just being an interest in innovation and job creation, do have economic returns that in the aggregate are interesting. I'm not going to suggest that your startup is going to be the next unicorn, but in the aggregate, hopefully if we create more startups, a few of them will become large. But returns are highly asymmetric for startups. So as an investor, thinking about building a portfolio approach and not just investing in 1 or 2 startups, but hopefully thinking about investing in 10 or 20 or more, maybe even the number 500 perhaps might come to mind. Building a large portfolio is probably the best way to figure out how you might actually get reasonable returns from startups. Another thing that I think is an ongoing possibility is looking at the combination of real estate and startups as a way to hedge risk and drive some liquidity. So sometimes you can see that investments in startups create activity and interest in the real estate properties that are around where those startups congregate. And so investing in the real estate while investing in the startups might provide a hedge and might provide a return, at least on the real estate side. Okay, there's lots of accelerators around. I've run one. They're very challenging. The reality is most of them aren't that great, and a lot of them are going to die. Now, again, that's sort of like startups, and it's sort of like VCs. Most things suck. Most things don't work. Accelerator economics in particular are very difficult. Again, if you invest in a lot of startups, most of them aren't going to work. A few of them will work, and the wins will be small. And then a very few will be big, but it might take a while to see those returns. If you're running an accelerator, you should probably expect that you won't see very many returns for the first 3 years. And you probably won't see big returns for 5 to 7 years, if ever. So if you think running a startup is a bad idea, running an accelerator is an even worse idea. Barack, are you still here? Yeah, so and Hassan Aslanova, also an investor in an accelerator. That's a really bad idea. You should stop doing that. So now when we started, one of the things that we wanted to do was try and get scale as quickly as possible. It's hard when you're starting. You don't really know what you're doing. Trying to get a large portfolio of companies when you're first getting started is challenging. Knowing what to tell them is challenging. How do you get follow-on investors and downstream investors when you're first getting started? I think just in general, there's a lot of challenges with getting accelerators off the ground. I think things that can help is to focus on specific verticals. So the more that we see accelerators get started now, the more they're focused on a specific area. That might be fintech, it might be e-commerce, it might be gaming. But having some area of focus allows you to probably have a little bit more differentiation from other accelerators. And it probably also forms a natural opportunity for sponsorship with corporates that might have an interest in those areas. So you're seeing more companies and sometimes academic and government sponsors who have an affiliation with an accelerator program where there's a specific area of expertise that they might have an interest in or even have some expertise in. The reality is that you have to be extremely creative about running a startup accelerator, and probably most of us who do it, we do it for love, not for money. We do it because we're interested in helping startups, because we want to see people succeed, and because it's fun and it's interesting. It's a really tough job. If you don't find it fun, I would probably not recommend it for most of you. Here's another problem. Employees generally in a lot of emerging markets don't believe in equity, probably rightfully so. It's not usually worth anything. And so they want cash. They don't really care about equity. And because they don't care about equity, the founders don't want to give them equity. Why should I give you equity? You don't care about it. You just want the dollars. Well, the reality is that most ecosystems that are really vibrant happen because there are lots of small winners. When I worked at PayPal about 13, 14 years ago, I was employee number 250. A lot of people, in my bio will suggest that I was one of the founders of PayPal or I was early at PayPal. Well, I joined PayPal 3 years after the company was started, almost 4 years, just a few months before the IPO. And I didn't expect that I was going to make a lot of money from my stock options. I made maybe about $1 million. After taxes, probably about half that. I paid off some debts. I bought a car for my mom. I bought a car for some friend of mine. And I had some money left over, and I was really kind of scared about the real estate market in California. It was kind of going a little crazy at that time. So I was like, well, I'm going to put some money into startups. I followed the footsteps of Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman. And so I started making small investments, maybe about $25,000 average, in about 10, 13 companies over the next 4 years. I got really lucky. 3 of those 13 investments ended up being 100 million plus exits: Mint.com, SlideShare, and Mashery. SlideShare is what I actually used to put these slides on today. And as a result of that, I was a little bit, helpful in getting those companies off the ground. And so it's really been great in seeing that, PayPal, I won't go into the whole PayPal story, but there's been at least 7 or 8 unicorns that came out of PayPal, been hundreds of companies that have been started, many that were invested in. But it was great to see McClure as an example of correcting maybe after the fact that there weren't equity. I believe the founder actually distributed a substantial amount of capital to other employees in the company. And it's that type of behavior that's what's going to create more companies, more angel investors, more people with expertise who are angel investors. So sometimes even if employees don't value equity and don't want equity, and even though founders don't want to give them equity, there's an important component to building an equity culture and spreading equity widely among the company, not just among founders or management team, because you are creating the next generation of investors and the next generation of startups. And that's a critical thing for countries to get off the ground, is to have that equity culture built in. Okay, now everybody's up here talking about, oh, you need to go global. Global is really important. Don't just stay in your local market. Well, I'm sort of a contrarian on that. I actually think that most startups should start in their own local markets, particularly if you already have a population of, say, 50 million to 100 million people, depending on internet penetration. That's probably enough to get started. People think, oh, well, the globe is so much bigger. The US or China or Europe is so much bigger. 50 million people is a pretty damn big market. If you can't build a business in a country with 50 million people, you're probably a crappy entrepreneur and you shouldn't be doing it anywhere. At the very least, you should be trying to find your initial MVP and your initial product market fit in a market where you know what's going on. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't come to the Silicon Valley or London or Berlin or wherever you want to go. If you really want to go to those markets, you want to build a big global business, go right ahead. I'm not going to try and stop you. But the challenge is, for a lot of entrepreneurs who go to other countries, it's not easy to get started. It's not easy to conduct business in another language. And if you're going to do that, you just have to go, right? But there are a lot of businesses, like McClure's $600 million business that was created here in Turkey. There's also businesses like Udemy that were started by Turkish founders and found a footprint in the US and found a way to start globally. But I would not look past your local market or larger regional markets as opportunities to get started, and then, of course, jump to other markets as you see fit. Lastly, most founders and most investors just don't think that their market is as good as Silicon Valley. Our entrepreneurs aren't as good as Silicon Valley. Our investors aren't as good as Silicon Valley. Oh, Silicon Valley's this big gold mountain. I have to go to Silicon Valley if I want to be a really great entrepreneur. Bullshit! Bullshit. What is Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley is comprised of people who came from other places. It's you. I was born in West Virginia, arguably a third world country in America. It was not Silicon Valley. I was not surrounded by people throwing money at me. I was not surrounded by other founders and entrepreneurs. I had to go to Silicon Valley to really surround myself with that. But the dirty little secret is Silicon Valley isn't really a place. It's a state of mind. It's a belief. In the face of insanity, it's a belief that you will be successful. In the reality of the story that 80% of startups fail, probably more than 80% of startups fail, we still jump off the cliff. We still decide that we could be successful. In Silicon Valley, we are surrounded by crazy people who know the odds and still jump off the cliff. You look to the guy on the left, look to the girl on the right, you go, you guys are going to fail, I'm going to succeed, you jump off the cliff. Now, the good news is that hopefully one of us is successful and I jump onto their parachute if I suck. And a lot of our ecosystems in Silicon Valley are predicated on the fact that thousands of companies are created every year. At least a few of them are going to be successful. Right? So it's that collective insanity that is what produces those results. If we were all rational human beings, we would not do startups. It would not make any sense. If we were rational investors, we would not invest in startups. And so doing individual acts of insanity might not be sane, but doing collective acts of insanity is sane. In fact, it's smart. We have to convince other people to jump with us. We have to jump off that cliff together, hopefully with different types of planes, and hopefully one of those planes starts flying. The biggest problem is not usually a lack of ability, a lack of capital, or a lack of opportunity. The biggest challenge is a lack of confidence in your head. You think you're not as good as Silicon Valley. You think your entrepreneurs are not as good as Silicon Valley. You think your investors are not as good as Silicon Valley. I don't care if you're right. Don't worry about it. Silicon Valley is comprised of people like you who've come to Silicon Valley from other places. They're no better or worse than you. They are you. The only difference is that we have the insanity and the confidence that we might actually win. You need to capture that mindset as well. You're good enough, you're smart enough. Get off your ass and get going. Whether you build a business here in Turkey, in the regional market of the Middle East, in Europe, in the US, in China, wherever. Just have that confidence. You can be as good as Silicon Valley. You are better than Silicon Valley. You're raising capital and building businesses in conditions much harsher, much tougher than Silicon Valley. You're better than Silicon Valley. No. Stop clapping because most of you still suck. But the conditions here, here's the thing. The conditions anywhere around the world for starting a business are easier than they were 20 years ago in Silicon Valley. It's easier to build a business here than it was to build a business in Silicon Valley 20 years ago. 20 years ago, people were excited to build businesses in Silicon Valley. Why are you complaining about any of this shit? It's cheaper, it's easier, there's more customers, there's more opportunity. Get off your ass and get started. All right, that's all I have to say. I have one more thing. Could I welcome two other individuals to the stage with me? Yes, Erhan and Erbil. We believe in entrepreneurs globally. We invest globally. We've invested in Turkey. We've invested in 8 companies that were started by Turkish entrepreneurs. We're announcing a $15 million fund to invest in Turkish entrepreneurs and 100 companies over the next few years, led by, Turks. Erhan Erdogan is going to be our venture partner here in Turkey, and he's going to be funding startups. So pummel him after this session, not me. Erbil Kahraman is still working at Facebook and is going to be an advisor to the fund. He's helped and worked with many other companies, including Udemy and others, come to the US. We're really excited to be investing in Turkey. We're really excited to have you help build businesses, and we want to work with both investors and entrepreneurs and companies here. Thank you very much.